An autistic boy was humiliated in the classroom after saying that his father was a farmer. The next day, a luxury car stopped in front of the school. Ethan was a 10-year-old boy who lived surrounded by the vast, serene landscapes of rural Texas. His days began early, always with the warm golden sunlight seeping through the thin curtains of his small wooden room. The distant mooing of cows, the gentle clucking of chickens, and the wind rustling through the endless fields of tall grass were the symphony that welcomed him to each new day. Life on the farm was not just Ethan's reality, it was his sanctuary. He loved every detail of it, the earthy smell after the rain, the rough texture of hay beneath his fingertips, and especially the animals who seemed to understand him better than most people ever did. Ethan was autistic, and though he struggled to connect with people, he shared an unspoken bond with every living creature on the farm. He could spend hours sitting under the old oak tree behind the barn, softly humming melodies only the animals seemed to appreciate. The cows would gather around him, the goats would lie by his side, and the horses, tall and majestic, would lower their heads as if listening attentively. His parents, Sarah and Mike, often watched from a distance, hearts full of quiet pride. They knew their son was special, not because of his challenges, but because of the tenderness and wisdom he carried, so rare in someone so young. Unlike the hustle and bustle of the nearest town, life on the farm moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. Ethan's daily routine involved helping his father with simple chores, feeding the animals, collecting eggs, and sometimes even helping guide the cattle. Mike, his father, was a man of few words but profound integrity, and he cherished these moments with Ethan, silently passing down lessons about resilience, respect for nature, and the value of hard work. Sarah, always warm and patient, made sure Ethan never felt out of place, gently guiding him through the complexities of emotions and social nuances. School, however, was a different story. For Ethan, the transition from the open skies of the farm to the crowded hallways of the local elementary school in town was always overwhelming. He never quite felt at ease among the other children, who often saw his quiet demeanor as strange. His classmates, though not cruel by nature, lacked the maturity to understand his silence, his literal interpretations, and his fascination with the farm animals he often mentioned. Ethan's teachers tried to be supportive, but they too struggled to bridge the gap. They noticed how he flinched at loud noises, how he avoided eye contact, and how he seemed more connected to the world outside the windows than to the lessons being taught. Yet despite all this, Ethan loved to learn. He had a deep curiosity, especially when it came to animals, plants, and the natural world. He could name every breed of cattle his father raised, explain the migration patterns of local birds, and even understood the delicate balance of maintaining healthy soil. His intelligence was never the issue. It was the social labyrinth of school life that left him isolated. Ethan never complained, though. He endured each school day with quiet determination, returning home to the comforting familiarity of the farm, where judgment was absent and love was unconditional. His parents often exchanged worried glances, knowing their son's heart was heavy, but unsure how to help without sheltering him too much. They wanted Ethan to find his place, to be proud of who he was, and to see the beauty in the life they had built. Despite his struggles, Ethan found joy in the simple things. He loved helping his mother bake cornbread, watching the butter melt slowly into the warm crust. He cherished riding in the old tractor with his father, feeling the vibrations of the engine through the worn leather seat. The farm was more than home. It was where Ethan could be fully himself, free from judgment or misunderstanding. The town itself was a typical Texan community, where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled faster than the wind. Families gathered at the local church on Sundays, shared stories at the diner, and bonded during county fairs. But even in such a tight-knit community, differences often stood out more than they should. Ethan's family was respected for their hard work, but whispers about Ethan being different were not uncommon, even if said without malice. Ethan, however, was blissfully unaware of most of these murmurs. His world was smaller, centered around the farm, his parents, and the animals he loved. He dreamed of one day expanding the farm, making it a place where people could come and learn about the importance of agriculture and the beauty of rural life. He imagined fields filled with visitors, children petting the goats, families picking fresh vegetables, and everyone understanding, as he did, how magical the simple things could be. As he lay in bed each night, listening to the comforting sounds of the farm settling in for the evening, Ethan often wondered if the world beyond the farm could ever feel as safe and welcoming as his little corner of Texas. He did not yet know that soon, the same world that seemed so distant and harsh would be forced to see him, not as different but as extraordinary. In those quiet nights, with stars scattered across the vast Texan sky, Ethan held on to hope, unaware that the very next day would set into motion events that would forever change the way people saw him, his family, and the life they led on that humble yet remarkable farm. The following morning unfolded like any other. Ethan awoke at dawn to the gentle sounds of the farm slowly coming to life. The familiar sight of dew on the grass and the smell of fresh hay greeted him as he helped his father feed the animals before preparing for school. His heart was calm, filled with the quiet joy that only the farm could provide. Yet today was not just any ordinary day. It was the day each student in his class was expected to present about their family, a tradition meant to celebrate heritage and community. Ethan's parents had encouraged him to share about the farm. They knew how much he loved it and believed that talking about it might help the other children understand him better. Sarah had even helped him rehearse, suggesting that he focus on what he loved most: the animals, the crops, and the meaningful work that sustained their lives. Though nervous, Ethan agreed. He wanted, more than anything, to be seen not just as the quiet boy in the corner, but as someone with something valuable to share. When he arrived at school, the usual anxiety crept in as he walked through the crowded hallways. The buzzing chatter, the fluorescent lights, and the sharp sounds of lockers slamming shut overwhelmed his senses. Yet he held tightly to the small note cards his mother had helped him prepare, finding comfort in their familiarity. As he sat quietly in his classroom, he watched as one by one his classmates took turns speaking about their parents. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, business owners, all professions that drew immediate admiration from their peers. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. He stood heart-pounding and walked to the front of the room. The teacher offered him an encouraging smile, but Ethan's gaze remained fixed on his note cards. He began softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the overhead lights. "My name is Ethan and my dad is a farmer." For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then came the first chuckle. It was small, almost hesitant, but it was enough to make Ethan pause. As he continued speaking of how his father raised cattle, grew vegetables, and cared for the land, more laughter followed, this time less restrained. Some students whispered behind cupped hands, exchanging glances and snickering. A boy in the back muttered, "Farmer like dirt and cows." Another added, "Do you guys even have internet out there?" The words cut deeper than they realized. Ethan's cheeks flushed, and he struggled to keep reading from his note cards. The once practiced lines now felt like a trap, exposing him to ridicule rather than admiration. The teacher attempted to intervene, raising her hand to quiet the class, but the damage had already been done. Ethan hurried through the rest of his presentation, skipping over much of what he had planned to say. When he returned to his seat, head lowered, he could still hear the faint giggles and whispered jokes. His hands trembled slightly as he packed away his note cards, wishing he could disappear. The day dragged on, each class feeling heavier than the last. Ethan avoided looking at anyone directly, retreating into himself as the laughter and whispers seemed to follow him wherever he went. During lunch, the teasing continued. One of the boys, emboldened by the reaction earlier, loudly joked, "Hey Ethan, do your cows have names? Do they do math too?" The surrounding students burst into laughter, some looking unsure but laughing. Anyway, unwilling to stand out, Ethan simply lowered his head, focusing on the untouched sandwich in front of him. As the afternoon wore on, the teasing evolved into a full-fledged rumor. By recess, most of the students were repeating the phrase, "Ethan's poor and only has cows," as if it was some hilarious punchline. It spread like wildfire through the playground and into the hallways. Ethan, overwhelmed and unable to processed the barrage of mockery, found a quiet corner behind the school's old oak tree, and stayed there until the final bell rang. When the school day finally ended, Ethan walked to the pickup area where Mike was waiting in their weathered pickup truck. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Mike immediately noticed the slump in his son's shoulders, the way his eyes avoided contact, and the heavy silence that seemed to engulf him. He knew something was wrong, but chose not to press, respecting the unspoken need for space. As they drove past the wide fields and grazing cattle, the quiet comfort of home felt distant to Ethan, as though the ridicule had followed him beyond the school's walls. At dinner, Sarah noticed it too. Ethan, usually eager to share stories about the farm or what he learned at school, ate in silence. His fork merely pushed food around his plate. Sarah and Mike exchanged concerned glances, but decided to give him time. Still, their hearts ached watching their son so clearly burdened by something neither of them fully understood yet. Later that evening, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the wooden beams of his ceiling, he replayed every moment of the day in his mind. The laughter, the whispers, the dismissive looks, they echoed louder than the peaceful chirping of crickets outside. For the first time, he questioned the life he loved. Was the farm really something to be ashamed of? He had always seen it as magical, filled with lessons and beauty, yet at school it was treated as a joke. Tears silently rolled down his cheeks as he pulled the quilt his mother had made tighter around himself. He longed to stay on the farm forever, away from the cruel eyes and mocking voices. Tomorrow seemed unbearable, and as he drifted into a restless sleep, the once comforting sounds of the farm could not soothe the storm swirling inside him. The next morning dawned with the same tranquil rhythm as always on the farm, but Ethan felt no comfort in the familiar sights and sounds. His feet dragged across the wooden floor as he prepared for another day at school, the weight of the previous day clinging to him like a heavy cloak. His mother tried to lift his spirits with his favorite breakfast, warm biscuits and honey, but Ethan barely touched his plate. Sarah's soft questions were met with monosyllabic answers, and Mike's usual morning pat on the shoulder went unnoticed. Ethan's silence, usually accepted as part of who he was, now carried an unsettling heaviness. At school, the whispers began before Ethan even reached his locker. The teasing had not only survived the night but had intensified, gaining momentum, like a wildfire. The phrase "Ethan's poor and only has cows" echoed through the hallways, passed from student to student, with the cruel delight of those who had found easy entertainment at someone else's expense. Some added embellishments, turning the rumor into outright fiction. "Did you hear? Ethan sleeps in a barn," one girl whispered, giggling as if it were the most amusing thing she had ever said. Another added, "His dad probably milks the cows at night just to have dinner." Each joke, though ridiculous, cut deeper and deeper into Ethan's fragile sense of belonging. Ethan, overwhelmed, felt like the walls of the school were closing in on him. The usual discomfort of the crowded hallways was now replaced with fear and humiliation. Each laugh, each pointing finger, and each mocking glance felt like a personal attack. He kept his head down, gripping his backpack tightly, as if it could shield him from the storm of cruelty that raged around him. Teachers, caught up in their routines, failed to notice the subtle yet devastating shift in Ethan's demeanor. By recess, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Groups of students gathered, whispering and laughing at Ethan's expense. Even those who had not paid much attention to him before joined in, eager to be part of the spectacle. The playground, once a chaotic but tolerable place, became a minefield of mockery. Ethan tried to find refuge under the old oak tree, but even there he was not safe. A group of boys approached, cornering him with jeers and taunts. "Are you going to teach us how to talk to cows, farmer boy?" one sneered. Another added, "Do you even know what a real house looks like?" Ethan remained silent, his breathing shallow and his vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. He wanted to run, to disappear, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The oak tree that had once felt like a safe haven now stood powerless against the cruelty of his peers. No one intervened. The teachers supervising recess were too far or too distracted to notice. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of recess, Ethan slipped away unnoticed, his spirit crushed. The ridicule continued throughout the day, with students passing notes and making mooing sounds whenever Ethan walked by. The humiliation was relentless. He barely spoke during class, and when called upon, his voice trembled so much that the teacher quietly moved on, sparing him further embarrassment, but leaving the issue unaddressed. The sanctuary of the farm felt like a distant memory, unreachable from the sterile and hostile walls of the classroom. At lunchtime, Ethan sat alone at the edge of the cafeteria, poking at his food. He heard his name whispered from table to table, each retelling of the rumor growing more exaggerated. Some students claimed his family was homeless, that they lived entirely off the land because they could not afford groceries. Others speculated that Ethan had never seen a city before and probably did not even own a television. Every assumption was more ridiculous than the last, yet no one stopped to consider how Ethan felt. To them, he was merely the subject of the day's entertainment. When the final bell rang, Ethan was among the first to leave, eager to escape the torment. He walked briskly to the pickup area, hoping to avoid any lingering classmates. His father, was already waiting, the old pickup truck idling by the curb. Mike's eyes immediately noticed the slump in Ethan's posture and the vacant look in his eyes. Ethan climbed in silently, offering no greeting. The ride home was quiet, the only sound being the gentle hum of the engine and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. As they crossed the familiar dirt roads leading back to the farm, Mike glanced at his son, deeply concerned. Ethan stared blankly out the window, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the worn strap of his backpack. The farm came into view, with its golden fields and grazing cattle, but Ethan showed no sign of the usual comfort it brought him. He did not rush out of the truck to greet the animals or help with the evening chores as he normally would. That night at dinner, Sarah and Mike watched helplessly as Ethan barely touched his food, answering questions with nods or shrugs. His usual excitement when talking about the animals or the little discoveries he made each day was absent. Mike, sensing the depth of his son's hurt, clenched his jaw in frustration, but he held back his questions, unwilling to push Ethan before he was ready. Sarah, holding back tears, tried to engage Ethan gently, but he only managed to whisper, "I do not want to go to school tomorrow." The weight of those words settled heavily over the dinner table. Mike and Sarah exchanged a silent, worried glance, realizing the situation was worse than they had feared. Ethan, normally so resilient despite his struggles, was now visibly defeated. His safe space, the farm, seemed unable to protect him from the cruelty of the outside world. Sarah reached for Ethan's hand, holding it tightly as if trying to transfer all the strength and love she could. Mike, though quiet, made a silent vow to himself that night that he would not let this go unanswered. As Ethan retreated to his room, curling up under his familiar quilt, he felt more alone than ever. The walls that once offered comfort now felt confining. The quiet sounds of the night, usually soothing, were drowned out by the echoes of laughter and ridicule from the day. He buried his face into his pillow, wishing he could disappear into the fields, into the safety of the farm where no one mocked him for who he was or where he came from. He did not know it yet, but change was already on its way, and the next dawn would bring not only light, but an unexpected turn of events. That night the farm was unusually quiet, not because the wind had stopped or the animals had hushed, but because the absence of Ethan's usual presence made it feel empty. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched apple pie she had baked earlier, hoping it might cheer Ethan up after dinner. Mike stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the barn silhouetted against the darkening sky. Both parents felt a growing sense of helplessness. They had weathered storms, droughts, and harsh winters, but nothing felt as overwhelming as watching their son retreat into silence. Ethan did not speak much during dinner, but that was not unusual on its own. What worried Sarah and Mike was the vacant look in his eyes, the way he mechanically pushed his food around without eating, and how he avoided looking at either of them. When Sarah gently asked about his day, Ethan barely shook his head. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Mike, not one to push, simply reached out and gave Ethan's hand a firm but gentle squeeze. Ethan's only response was a quiet murmur, "I do not want to go back tomorrow." Then, Without another word, he excused himself from the table and disappeared into his room. The sound of his door softly clicking shut felt louder than thunder to Sarah and Mike. Sarah immediately turned to Mike, her voice trembling. "He has never said that before. Never." Mike nodded slowly, gripping the edge of the table. No," he replied, eyes fixed on the empty doorway. For the next hour, neither said much, both processing the weight of their son's words. They knew children could be unkind, especially to someone who struggled with social interaction like Ethan, but they had hoped the teachers or the small-town kindness would shield him. Clearly, they had been wrong. Mike was a man who rarely spoke about his emotions, but that night, watching his wife quietly cry into her hands, he felt something shift inside him. The farm, with all its demands and routines, had never taught him how to fix this. He could mend fences, birth calves, and handle machinery with ease, but how did you repair the spirit of a 10-year-old boy crushed by cruelty? He excused himself silently and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin as he walked aimlessly around the property. The animals stirred quietly as he passed, and the stars overhead seemed indifferent to the weight in his chest. Meanwhile, inside, Sarah tried to coax Ethan out of his room. She knocked softly, whispering his name, promising they could talk about anything. Ethan, curled up under his quilt, pretended to be asleep, too overwhelmed to find words. His mind was tangled with the jeers and laughter from school, and his heart ached from the isolation. He loved the farm, loved his parents, but he dreaded returning to school more than anything. Sarah, defeated, sat outside his door, leaning her head against the wooden frame, whispering softly that she loved him no matter what. When Mike finally returned inside, he found Sarah still sitting there. He helped her up and held her close. "We will figure this out," he said, more to convince himself than his wife. As they prepared for bed, neither could sleep. Mike stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with anger, sorrow, and a gnawing feeling that there had to be something he could do. Sarah quietly cried into her pillow, mourning not only for her son's hurt, but for the innocence that seemed to have been stripped from him so suddenly. Ethan lay awake too, staring at the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through his curtains. He thought about the cows he loved so much, about the goats that always nuzzled him affectionately, and the horses that seemed to understand his silences. He wondered why the other kids could not see what he saw. The farm was not just a place. It was life, beauty, and hard-earned peace. Yet to them it was something to laugh at. He wanted to tell his parents, but how could he explain the sting of those words? How could he make them understand how deep the embarrassment ran? The next morning, Ethan barely spoke during breakfast. Sarah tried to encourage him with gentle reminders about the animals waiting for him after school, but Ethan only nodded faintly. When it was time to leave, he hesitated at the door, backpack slung loosely over his shoulder. "Do I have to go today?" he asked quietly. Sarah's heart broke at the plea in his voice. Mike, who was fixing his hat by the door, paused. There was a long silence before he answered. "You do not," he said firmly. Ethan blinked, surprised, as Mike knelt down to meet his son's eyes. "But if you want, you can stay home today." Ethan simply nodded and set his backpack down without saying another word. Sarah looked at Mike, eyes wide, but said nothing. She trusted her husband's instincts. Ethan spent the day quietly wandering the farm, feeding the animals, brushing the horses, and sitting beneath the old oak tree behind the barn. The animals gave him a comfort no words could, and the wide-open skies seemed to ease the heaviness on his shoulders, even if only slightly. Mike watched from afar, still unsure of what to do. He could not bear to see Ethan lose the sparkle he carried when among the animals. Later that evening, as Ethan sat quietly by the fireplace, Mike finally asked, "Son, you want to tell me what happened at school?" Ethan hesitated. He looked at his father, then back at the flickering flames. Slowly, haltingly, he began to speak. His voice was shaky, but the words came out. The laughter, the jokes, the way the other kids had mocked his family and the farm. He told his father about how he had wanted to make them proud, how he thought talking about the farm would show them something special, but instead, it had made him a target. Mike listened without interruption, his heart breaking with each word. Sarah sat quietly nearby, tears streaming down her face as she listened to the full story. When Ethan finished, he simply asked, "Is it bad to be a farmer?" The question hit Mike like a punch. He took a deep breath and answered, "No, son. It is one of the best things a person can be." But inside, Mike knew words were not enough. He had to show Ethan and everyone else just how much pride there was in their life. As Ethan went to bed, Mike stayed up late, staring into the Kaya's fire, formulating a decision that would surprise not only Sarah but the entire town. He would make sure no one ever looked down on his son or their farm again. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, the weight of his confession still hung heavily in the small farmhouse. Mike sat silently in the living room, his elbows resting on his knees, staring into the dying flames of the fireplace. Sarah remained nearby, wiping tears from her cheeks, but watching her husband with cautious eyes. She could sense that Mike was deep in thought, wrestling with emotions he rarely showed. It was not anger at the children who had mocked Ethan. Mike knew all too well that kids could be cruel without understanding the damage they inflicted, but a deep sadness and a strong desire to protect his son from the ugliness of the world. Mike was not a man who spoke often, but when he did, his words carried weight. As he sat there, the memories of his own childhood rushed back, uninvited. He had grown up not far from this very town and had experienced his share of ridicule for being the son of a farmer. The laughter, the comments, the dismissive looks, they were familiar echoes from his past. He had buried them deep, choosing instead to focus on building a life with integrity and hard work. But now, watching his son face the same humiliations, those old wounds reopened, raw and painful. He replayed Ethan's trembling voice again and again in his mind, especially that one heartbreaking question, "Is it bad to be a farmer?" The fact that Ethan even doubted the dignity of their way of life cut Mike deeper than he could admit. Mike knew he had taught Ethan about crops, about caring for livestock, about respecting the land, but maybe he had not taught him enough about pride. Pride not in arrogance, but pride rooted in understanding the value of honest work, of nurturing life, of contributing something real to the world. Sarah noticed Mike's tightened jaw and the distant look in his eyes. She quietly asked, "What are you thinking?" But Mike remained silent, lost in contemplation. He knew rushing into school demanding apologies or confronting the children would only make things worse for Ethan. He also knew that just keeping Ethan home would not solve anything. Ethan would still carry the shame and humiliation inside him. No, Mike realized, this had to be about more than just defending his son. It had to be about showing everyone, including Ethan, what the farm and the people who worked it truly meant. As the hours passed, Mike stood up suddenly and walked out, into the cold night without saying a word. Sarah watched him disappear beyond the porch, but she knew better than to follow. Mike always found his answers under the open sky. He wandered among the barns and pens, listening to the gentle sounds of the animals settling in for the night, the rhythmic breathing of the cows, the soft rustling of the horses in the stables, the distant hoot of an owl. It all reminded him of the life he had built, of its quiet, unassuming beauty. He knew the solution would not be found in anger, but in dignity. He needed Ethan to see that there was nothing to hide or be ashamed of, and more importantly, he needed the entire town, the students and the teachers, to recognize the truth of who they were. In the stillness of the farm, under the vast spread of stars, Mike made up his mind. He would show them, not through words alone, but through presence and example. He would make sure that when Ethan walked back into that school, it would not be with his head down, but with quiet confidence. By the time Mike returned inside, Sarah was waiting, anxious, but patient. Mike simply looked at her and said, "I have a plan." He did not elaborate, but the steadiness in his voice told Sarah everything she needed to know. She trusted him. Mike was not one for grand gestures, but when he acted, it was with purpose. Sarah nodded silently and went to prepare for bed, though she doubted either of them would sleep much. The next day, Mike woke up before dawn, as always, but instead of going through his regular routine, he made a few quiet phone calls and spent the day making arrangements. He refused to tell Sarah the details, only reassuring her that he knew what he was doing. Ethan, noticing the unusual energy in his father, remained quiet, still wrapped in the emotions of the previous day. He helped with the chores, feeding the animals and tending to the garden, but he rarely spoke, his spirit visibly dulled. Mike, meanwhile, worked with quiet determination. He polished the old Ford F-150 that had long been the family's workhorse. The truck, though reliable, had never been a symbol of luxury. But what most people in town did not know was that Mike also owned a newer, more impressive vehicle, a Ford F-150 Platinum, which he kept in storage for special occasions. It was not vanity, but practicality. Mike had never felt the need to flaunt it, but now he saw its purpose clearly. It was not about showing wealth, but about making people realize they knew nothing about his family's reality. That evening, when Sarah questioned Mike once more about his intentions, he simply replied, "Tomorrow they will see." His words were calm but resolute. Sarah, though worried, trusted Mike's judgment, knowing that whatever he had planned came from the deep love and protective instinct he had always shown for their son. She could see it in the way he carefully prepared everything, not with anger, but with a quiet, determined pride. Ethan went to bed that night unaware of his father's plan, still uncertain about whether he could face another day at school. As he drifted into a restless sleep, the painful memories of laughter and taunts haunted him. Yet outside, under the wide Texas sky, Mike stood beside the newly prepared truck, eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to change the story that had hurt his son so deeply. For Mike, it was never about proving anyone wrong, but about making sure his son knew, truly knew, that the life they lived was nothing less than remarkable. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. As the first stars began to fade into the dawn, Mike knew that the next day would not just be another day on the farm or another day at school. It would be the day everything changed. The morning sun rose lazily over the rolling fields, casting long golden rays across the familiar landscape of the farm. The crisp scent of fresh grass and the sound of distant cattle should have brought comfort to Ethan as he stood on the porch, beside Mike. But today felt different. Sarah stood quietly by the door, watching them both with cautious eyes. Ethan, uncertain of what was happening, noticed that Mike was not preparing the old, worn-out pickup truck they always used. Instead, parked just outside the barn, gleaming under the morning sun, was the Ford F-150 Platinum, polished to perfection, its chrome details reflecting the soft light. Ethan blinked, confused. He had only seen the truck a handful of times. It was kept in the back of the barn, covered and unused. Mike had always said it was for special occasions. Ethan could not imagine what made today special. His father, wearing his usual simple denim jacket, work boots and faded hat, calmly opened the door to the passenger side and nodded for Ethan to hop in. Sarah watched silently, her expression a mixture of worry and quiet hope. The drive to school was quiet but not heavy. Ethan, still unsure of what to make of the situation, glanced occasionally at his father, who kept his eyes on the road with a serene determination. The countryside slipped by in a blur of green and gold until they approached the town. As they neared the school, the sight of the familiar red brick building brought back the weight Ethan had felt the day before. His stomach tightened, and he shifted nervously in his seat. Mike noticed but said nothing. He simply patted Ethan's shoulder gently and kept driving. As the truck turned into the school's drop-off area, heads turned instantly. The parking lot, usually filled with standard sedans, minivans, and older pickups, now featured the gleaming presence of a top-of-the-line Ford F-150 Platinum. It was unmistakable, not just because of its luxury, but because it was so unexpected. Students paused mid-conversation, teachers glanced up from their morning routines, and parents waiting in line did a double-take. Whispers spread rapidly. "Whose truck is that?" "Is that Ethan's dad?" "I thought they were poor." Mike stepped out of the truck without a hint of hesitation. He looked no different from any other day, with his simple farm clothes and calm demeanor. But the juxtaposition of his modest appearance against the backdrop of the high-end truck made an immediate impression. He walked around to Ethan's side and opened the door. Ethan stepped out cautiously, feeling every eye in the parking lot on him. He noticed the surprise, the confusion, and even a hint of admiration on the faces of the same classmates who had mocked him only a day before. Mike stood tall, scanning the crowd briefly, before resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. He gave no explanation, no speech, no reaction to the murmurs around them. Together, they walked toward the school entrance, passing groups of students who suddenly found themselves speechless. Some of the boys who had teased Ethan the most stood frozen, watching the quiet display unfold before them. The contrast between the farm boy they had ridiculed and the reality standing in front of them challenged every assumption they had made. Inside the school, the rumors spread even faster. By the time Ethan and Mike reached the principal's office to sign in as visitors, nearly every student knew about the luxury truck and the scene at the drop-off zone. Teachers exchanged glances in the hallways, and students whispered excitedly. Some tried to piece together wild theories, while others simply stared when Ethan passed by. Mike's silent presence beside his son made it clear that this was no accident, no borrowed vehicle, but part of a deliberate choice. Ethan, though still unsure of what his father intended, could not help but notice the change. Where, yesterday, there were sneers and laughter, today there was silence and curiosity. It was subtle but undeniable. Even the teacher who greeted them at the door seemed unsure how to approach them. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." "Ethan," she said, her voice noticeably more careful than usual. Mike responded with a polite nod, his calm but firm demeanor leaving little room for further questions. As they walked through the hallways, Ethan noticed something else. The laughter that had haunted him was gone. Students watched from a distance, whispering, but without the mocking tone. It was as if they were re-evaluating everything they thought. They knew about him. The weight on Ethan's chest lessened slightly, not because of the truck itself, but because his father was showing him, without saying a word, that there was nothing to be ashamed of. The moment was not about wealth, nor about proving superiority. Mike's truck was a symbol, a visual contradiction to the assumptions the children had made. It forced them to confront the fact that their judgment had been shallow and uninformed. And yet, Mike said nothing about it. He simply stood beside his son, offering quiet support, allowing the message to sink in naturally. After signing in, Mike turned to Ethan and said gently, "I will be back soon. Just remember, you are worth more than anyone's opinion." Ethan nodded slowly, still absorbing everything. Mike gave him one last reassuring glance before heading out, leaving Ethan to navigate the school day with a new, unspoken sense of dignity. Outside, the truck remained parked, its presence continuing to stir conversations. Inside, Ethan felt a shift. He still feared the whispers, but for the first time, he also felt something else. Curiosity from others, maybe even respect. The same classmates who had mocked him were now unsure, hesitant and perhaps even a little embarrassed. As the school day went on, Ethan noticed fewer taunts and more glances filled with uncertainty. No one dared to openly mock him. Teachers treated him more attentively, students gave him space, and some even looked as if they wanted to approach, but were unsure how. The hall still buzzed with energy, but it was different, more subdued, more thoughtful. Ethan, though overwhelmed, found himself walking with his head just a little higher. He did not fully understand the power of what his father had done, but he felt it. And deep down, perhaps for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, things could change. Not because of a fancy truck, but because someone had finally challenged the story everyone thought they knew about the boy from the farm. And tomorrow, Mike's plan would unfold even further. The truck was only the beginning. The following day arrived cloaked in anticipation. News of the previous morning's spectacle had circulated through every hallway, whispered during every recess, and even reached the ears of teachers and parents alike. Ethan's classmates arrived early, eager to see if the mysterious scene would repeat itself. To their surprise, the Ford F-150 Platinum once again glided into the school's parking lot, shimmering under the soft morning sun. This time, however, Mike's intentions were far from silent. He stepped out of the truck with the same simple attire, unaffected by the stares, and walked directly toward the school's entrance. His posture, calm but firm, radiated an unshakable presence that left students and teachers alike unusually quiet. Inside the school, the faculty had gathered in the teachers' lounge, already discussing the events. Mike was well known in the community, but mostly as a hard-working farmer who preferred to keep to himself. His arrival the day before had left everyone unsettled. Now, seeing him stride through the hallways with purpose, they exchanged uncertain glances. The principal, Mr. Thompson, was waiting at the office, having already heard from several staff members about the murmurs running wild among the students. "Mr. Miller," he greeted cautiously. Mike nodded. "Good morning. I would like to speak to Ethan's class this morning," he said, leaving no room for negotiation. His voice was steady, respectful, but resolute. Mr. Thompson hesitated, glancing toward his secretary, then back at Mike. He knew he could not refuse, especially not after what had unfolded. Within half an hour, Ethan's entire class sat restless in their seats, buzzing with speculation. The teasing had diminished significantly since the truck's appearance, but curiosity now filled the void. As the door opened and Mike stepped into the room, silence fell like a heavy blanket. Students who had jeered days ago now fidgeted nervously, unsure of what to expect. The teacher welcomed Mike politely, but clearly appeared uneasy, unsure of how the children would react. Mike stood at the front of the classroom, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. His eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of every student, including those who had led the mockery. His calm demeanor carried more authority than anger ever could. "Good morning," he began simply. "I am Mike Miller. I am Ethan's dad." His words, spoken without theatrics, immediately held the attention of every child. He continued, "Ethan shared with us what happened during your presentations. I want to tell you a little about our farm and why we are proud of it." There was no trace of bitterness in his tone. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the value of every seed sown and every drop of sweat spilled. He described their daily life, not as a fairy tale, but as a reality filled with hard work, responsibility, and purpose. He explained how raising animals and growing crops was not only their livelihood, but a crucial part of the community and the country. "Every glass of milk you drink, every burger you eat, every slice of bread likely began on a farm like ours," he said, glancing at the students who now listened with rapt attention. He described waking up before dawn, working through the seasons, and dealing with the unpredictable forces of nature. Yet, he emphasized the pride he took in feeding families, in caring for the land, and in teaching Ethan the values of patience, respect, and resilience. The children were visibly captivated, their earlier assumptions crumbling as they realized the depth of what Mike was sharing. Then, Mike gently steered the conversation toward Ethan. "Ethan loves this farm more than anything. He knows every animal by name. He can tell when a storm is coming better than the weather report, and he is learning how to be someone who contributes to the world." His voice softened, but he came home sad, thinking maybe it was something to be ashamed of. A deep silence settled over the room. Even the students who had been the most vocal in their teasing now stared at the floor, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Mike continued without reproach, "I was a kid like you once. I remember what it is like to laugh at something you do not understand. I am not angry, but I do want you to think about the words you choose, about the stories you believe without knowing the truth." His words were steady, carrying no threat, only truth. The power of his presence was undeniable. Even the teacher sat still, eyes wide, realizing the gravity of the moment unfolding in the room. To the students, it was as if the man before them was pulling back a curtain they never knew existed. The word farmer, once used to mock Ethan, now held a different weight, filled with images of hard work, knowledge, and an undeniable connection to life itself. They saw, maybe for the first time, that the person they had ridiculed was someone who carried within him a world they could barely comprehend. When Mike finished, he simply placed his hat back on his head and nodded. "Thank you for listening," he said. "I will leave you to your day." As he turned to leave, the room remained in stunned silence. No one dared whisper. No one giggled, and no one moved until long after the door clicked shut behind him. Ethan, sitting quietly in the corner, had not expected such a gesture. His heart pounded not with fear, but with a strange mixture of pride and relief. His father had not come to punish anyone or embarrass him further. He had come to tell the truth calmly and firmly. Ethan saw in the eyes of his classmates that they were no longer seeing just the farm boy. They were seeing someone they had never really known. The rest of the day unfolded differently. The usual jokes did not resurface. The whispers, once cruel, were now uncertain, even admiring. Ethan's teacher found small ways to include him in conversations, asking about the farm during class discussions, and students who had previously avoided him now exchanged glances, of curiosity rather than mockery. Mike's words had left a mark, not by demanding respect, but by showing the quiet dignity that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. As Ethan walked home that afternoon, he could not help but feel something shift inside him. He still feared the days to come, still carried the sting of the past day's cruelty, but for the first time he felt the beginnings of a new possibility. Maybe, just maybe, things were not as hopeless as they had seemed. And deep down, he knew his father had planted a seed that was about to grow in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The following morning, the usual chatter returned to the school, but it was quieter, more restrained, as if everyone was unsure how to behave after the previous day. Ethan, walking through the halls, noticed that while the pointing and whispers had not disappeared entirely, their tone had shifted. There were fewer smirks, more curious glances. Some students even looked as if they wanted to speak to him, though none dared yet. The memory of Mike standing confidently in the classroom lingered in every corner of the building. It was during the third period social studies class when the unexpected happened. The teacher, Mrs. Harper, whose curiosity had been piqued like everyone else's, decided to use the moment as an opportunity for a real-life lesson. "Since we have been learning about local industries and communities," she said, glancing toward Ethan, "maybe Ethan could tell us a bit more about his family's farm." The room fell into a tense silence. Ethan's heart pounded. His instinct was to shrink into his seat, but remembering his father's calm voice and steady eyes from the day before, he hesitantly nodded. Ethan stood up, clutching the edge of his desk for balance, and began to speak. His voice, though soft, carried enough strength to reach every corner of the room. "We raise cattle, grow vegetables, and take care of the land," he began, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. "We also supply food to stores and restaurants." There were a few nods around the room, but it was what came next that silenced even the most indifferent students. "My dad's farm," Ethan continued, swallowing hard, "is one of the biggest suppliers of organic food in the whole state. We sell to grocery stores and restaurants that you probably go to every week." Gasps broke out before Ethan could finish the sentence. Students turned to each other, eyes wide. Even Mrs. Harper's eyebrows lifted. A few students started whispering, naming well-known supermarket chains and popular restaurants that everyone in town frequented. The realization sank in slowly. The farm that had been the subject of their ridicule was not a struggling patch of dirt with a few cows as they had imagined. It was a cornerstone of their daily lives, feeding their families, supporting local businesses, and providing quality food far beyond their small town. Ethan glanced up briefly and noticed the looks of shock on his classmates' faces. The kids who had laughed the loudest were now the quietest. One of them, a boy who had mocked Ethan relentlessly, whispered under his breath, "No way." But there was no sarcasm this time, only disbelief. Mrs. Harper, recovering from the surprise, gently encouraged Ethan to continue. "Do you know how much you supply?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "A lot. We have contracts with stores all over Texas, and even a few in other states. My dad says we send out millions of pounds of food every year." His voice wavered slightly at the word millions, knowing it sounded unbelievable to some, but it was the truth. The class fell completely silent, absorbing the magnitude of Ethan's words. One girl raised her hand timidly. "You mean like the organic stuff my mom buys at Green Valley Market?" Ethan nodded again. "Yeah, my dad's farm sells to them." The ripple effect was immediate. Almost every student could now link their own dinner tables to Ethan's family. They realized that the boy they had dismissed as a simple farm kid was part of something much bigger, something they all unknowingly benefited from every day. Mrs. Harper, seizing the opportunity, praised Ethan. "That is an incredible contribution, Ethan. Thank you for sharing." Ethan, unused to praise, blushed and sat down quickly, but inside something shifted. For the first time, he felt not just tolerated, but seen. The students around him were no longer looking at him with ridicule, but with a mix of curiosity, respect, and even admiration. As the class ended, a few students lingered around Ethan's desk. "Is it true you guys supply Green Valley?" one asked. "Do you have, like, hundreds of cows?" another inquired, their tone no longer mocking but genuinely interested. Ethan answered softly, "We have over 300 cattle, yeah." The reactions were immediate. Wide eyes, murmurs of, "That is awesome," and for the first time, smiles not born of mockery but of genuine amazement. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, nearly the entire school knew the truth. Ethan's farm was not some backwoods cliché. It was a vital part of the community, an operation larger and more important than any of them had imagined. Students who had never given Ethan more than a passing glance now viewed him differently. Teachers who had overlooked his quiet nature now approached him, offering smiles and words of encouragement. Ethan, still overwhelmed by the sudden shift, navigated the day with cautious hope. He was not used to this kind of attention, but it felt different from before. It was not cruel, it was not shallow, it was born from realization. He noticed that even the students who had been the cruelest kept their distance, clearly unsure of how to face the boy they had underestimated so thoroughly. When Ethan returned home that afternoon, Sarah and Mike were waiting anxiously on the porch. Mike immediately noticed the faint smile on Ethan's face and the lighter step in his walk. "How was it, son?" he asked, hiding his nervousness behind his usual stoicism. Ethan, setting down his backpack, simply said, "They asked me questions about the farm." Sarah's eyes widened. "Good questions," Ethan nodded. "Yeah, they did not laugh." Mike exchanged a quiet look with Sarah, the kind of look that speaks louder than words. Without making a scene, he gently patted Ethan on the back and said, "Told you, son. Nothing to be ashamed of." That night, as they sat together at the dinner table, the air felt lighter. Ethan ate with more appetite, even sharing small stories about the questions his classmates had asked. The shift was not dramatic or flashy, but it was real. The seeds Mike had planted, not just on the land but in the hearts of the children at that school, had begun to sprout. Ethan did not fully understand yet just how deeply the truth had touched his classmates, but he felt it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was looking forward to tomorrow. And deep down, so was Mike. This was only the beginning. The farm story, Ethan's story, was no longer a joke. It was something worth listening to. And soon, even more would come to light. The next few days unfolded with a quiet transformation that no one had predicted. The ripple effects of Ethan's revelation spread far beyond the walls of his classroom. Throughout the school, teachers spoke differently about the value of rural life, integrating lessons about agriculture, sustainability, and the importance of food production into their classes. The principal, Mr. Thompson, even mentioned during the morning announcements how proud the school was to have families like Ethan's contributing so much to the community. Yet beneath all this change, there remained a silent question hanging in the air among students and teachers alike. Who exactly was Mike Miller beyond being a farmer? It was on Friday, during a school assembly dedicated to community appreciation, that this question would finally be answered. Mr. Thompson had invited Mike to speak again, this time not just to Ethan's class, but to the entire school. Mike agreed, knowing the importance of what needed to be said, not only for Ethan but for every student who had carried assumptions about people like him. The auditorium buzzed with murmurs as students filed in. Teachers exchanged glances, some still unsure how this humble farmer had so easily shifted the perspective of the entire student body. When Mike took the stage, dressed in the same simple clothes he always wore, the room fell into respectful silence. Mike stood tall, his eyes scanning the sea of young faces before he began. "I appreciate you all letting me speak again," Mike said plainly. "I want to tell you about the farm. But more than that, I want to tell you about what it means." His words were calm, without pretense, but carried the quiet authority of someone who spoke from experience. He spoke about how the farm had been in the Miller family for generations, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and now to him. He shared the story of how, decades ago, the land was nearly lost during a brutal drought, and how the community had rallied behind the family to help them rebuild. It wasn't charity, Mike clarified. It was neighbors helping neighbors, understanding that no one stands alone. As he continued, he revealed what none of the students and even many of the teachers had ever known. Mike had once been a young boy sitting in the very same auditorium, attending the very same school. "I sat where you sit now," he said, pointing gently toward the students, "and I remember very well what it felt like to be laughed at." The room shifted uncomfortably. Mike did not speak with anger, but with the quiet sadness of memory. "I was teased for wearing worn boots, for smelling like the farm, for being different. And I'll tell you, it hurt. But I also learned that there's no shame in working the land, there's no shame in feeding people. The shame is in not recognizing the value of others." The entire auditorium remained hushed, hanging on his every word. Mike described how he had chosen to stay and build the farm into what it was today, one of the largest organic food suppliers in the state. He spoke of contracts with supermarkets across Texas, the thousands of families who unknowingly relied on the food his land produced, and the countless hours of labor, strategy, and sacrifice that went into maintaining it. But he also shared something more personal. "I never told Ethan this," he said, glancing toward his son who sat in the front row. "But when I was his age, I almost gave up on the farm. I almost left, thinking it wasn't worth it. I thought the laughter meant I wasn't good enough. But my father, Ethan's grandfather, told me something I never forgot." Mike's voice softened. He said, "Son, what you grow feeds bodies, but how you live feeds souls." Those words hung in the air, settling into the hearts of every person present. Mike then explained how he had spent years working not just to grow food, but to build something that mattered, not only to his family, but to the community. He talked about the families who relied on them during hard times, about how the farm donated food to local shelters, about how they quietly sponsored school events and provided supplies for students in need without asking for recognition. By the time Mike finished, there were no whispers left, only silence. Teachers blinked back, tears, students sat motionless, and even Mr. Thompson seemed visibly moved. Mike ended with a simple statement. "This isn't just about my family. Every person you meet has a story you don't know. Remember that before you decide to laugh." The applause that followed was not polite or obligatory. It was genuine. Students clapped with sincerity, some even standing, realizing for the first time how blind they had been to the depth of the world outside their own. Ethan, sitting quietly, felt tears sting his eyes, not from sadness but from a mixture of pride and relief. His father had given him something far more powerful than protection. He had given him dignity. As the assembly ended, students approached Ethan cautiously. There were no jokes, no mockery, just questions and genuine conversation. "Is it true you guys helped the shelter downtown?" asked one. "How do you grow food without chemicals?" asked another. Ethan, overwhelmed but grateful, answered as best he could. Even the teacher, who had earlier looked uncomfortable, now spoke to Ethan with newfound respect, asking if she could bring her own children to visit the farm sometime. Mike and Sarah watched from a distance, their hearts swelling as they saw Ethan, surrounded by students who, for the first time, were not looking at him with amusement but with admiration. The farm had always been the heart of their family, but now it had also become a bridge, connecting a quiet boy to a world that finally wanted to listen. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, there was laughter at the table again. Ethan recounted the questions his classmates had asked, the compliments he had received, and even how some of the boys who used to tease him had awkwardly tried to apologize. Mike listened quietly, smiling, knowing the battle had not been fought with anger but with truth. Sarah, wiping away a tear discreetly, realized they had done more than defend their son. They had shown him and everyone else that true worth is never measured by appearances or assumptions. And while Ethan still knew that there would be hard days ahead, He also knew he would never again be ashamed to say, "My dad is a farmer," because now everyone knew just how much that truly meant. The following Monday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that made the farm's golden fields glisten beneath the early sun. Ethan, standing by the window of his room, looked out at the familiar sight and felt something stir inside him that he had not felt for days. Anticipation without dread. At breakfast, Sarah noticed the subtle change. Ethan was quieter, but not in the withdrawn way of the past week. He was thoughtful, perhaps even hopeful. Mike, preparing for the day's work, gave him a nod, silently acknowledging his son's growing resilience. At school, the shift was undeniable. The students no longer looked at Ethan as an object of ridicule. There were no jokes, no imitations, no whispers filled with cruelty. Instead, there was curiosity, cautious friendliness, and for some, even guilt. The story of Mike's assembly speech had spread not just through the students, but through their parents, who had discussed it over the weekend in diners, churches, and homes throughout town. Ethan's story was no longer a joke. It was an inspiration. That morning, the teacher announced an unexpected follow-up. "Since we've been learning about local businesses and the importance of community," she said, glancing meaningfully at Ethan, "we're going to open the floor today for anyone who wants to share something meaningful about their family." Ethan's heart began to pound. He had not planned on speaking, but as he saw the eyes of his classmates glance at him with expectation, not ridicule, he felt something inside pushing him forward. Ethan slowly raised his hand. The room fell silent as the teacher nodded encouragingly. Standing up, Ethan walked to the front of the class. His legs trembled slightly, but he steadied himself, remembering his father's words. "You are worth more than anyone's opinion." For a moment, he stood there, unsure where to begin. Then he simply spoke from the heart. "My name is Ethan, and I love my family's farm," he began, his voice clear despite the lump in his throat. "We work hard every day. My dad wakes up before the sun, and we take care of the animals, grow food, and help people. When I talked about it before, I thought you would think it was special like I do, but you laughed." His voice faltered briefly, but he pressed on, refusing to let the tears forming in his eyes stop him. "But I still love it. I'm proud of it. And I'm proud of my dad. He's the best person I know. He taught me that it doesn't matter if people laugh as long as you know who you are." A hush filled the classroom. The words, spoken without anger or accusation, carried more power than any adult lecture could have. Ethan's honesty, his quiet strength, touched everyone. Some students lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier behavior. Others leaned forward, visibly moved. Even the teacher blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Then, something unexpected happened. One by one, hands slowly began to rise. Students who had mocked him just days before now wanted to speak. "I'm sorry," one of the boys said, voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know." Another girl added, "I think it's really cool that you help feed people. I didn't realize." The apologies, though awkward and simple, were sincere. Ethan, surprised, simply nodded. He had not come expecting apologies, but hearing them lifted a weight he had carried alone. The emotional tension in the room was palpable. Even students who remained silent seemed deeply affected. What began as a simple school activity had turned into a moment none of them would forget. For Ethan, it was more than just acceptance. It was vindication. He realized that sharing his truth, standing up despite fear, had done more than silence the laughter. It had opened the hearts of those around him. After class, several students approached him individually. They asked about the farm, about the animals, about how they grew vegetables. Some even asked if they could visit someday. Ethan, overwhelmed but happy, quietly agreed. For the first time, they were not asking out of mockery, but out of genuine interest. His world, once so isolated inside the school walls, was beginning to open up. When Ethan returned home that day, Mike and Sarah were waiting, as always, but this time they immediately noticed the lightness in his step. Ethan did not wait to be asked. He sat down at the table and began telling them everything. How he had spoken in class, how his classmates had apologized, and how they even wanted to learn about the farm. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy, and Mike, though reserved, as always, could not hide the proud smile stretching across his face. That evening, around the dinner table, laughter returned to the Miller household, but this time it was accompanied by relief. Mike knew that the most difficult part was over, not because the challenges were gone, but because Ethan had found his voice, and with it, his strength. Sarah whispered as she cleared the dishes, "He did it. He really did it." Mike only nodded, eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude. Later that night, Ethan sat on the porch staring at the stars, the same ones he had often looked to for comfort. But tonight, he felt something different. Not just comfort, but hope. The world had not changed overnight, but something inside him had. And as he listened to the gentle sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of the animals, and the soft creak of the wooden porch, Ethan realized that the farm, his home, was not just a place of work. It was a place of love, strength, and belonging. He no longer wished to hide it. He wished to share it, and unbeknownst to him, the very next chapter of his story would show him just how much others were now eager to see it too. The farm, once seen by others as ordinary or outdated, was about to become the center of attention in a way Ethan never imagined. But tonight, all that mattered was the pride quietly settling in his heart, the pride of being exactly who he was. The next morning arrived with a calmness Ethan had not felt in days. The usual sense of dread was gone, replaced by cautious excitement. As he walked through the school gates, he noticed immediately that the atmosphere around him was different. Students greeted him, not all but many, with timid smiles and even a few shy waves. He kept walking, unsure how to react, but every step felt less heavy. The whispers that used to sting had been replaced by words like, "That's him," followed by, "His family's farm is huge," "He's the one who spoke yesterday." The tone had shifted completely. Ethan noticed that his classmates did not scatter away when he entered the classroom as they used to. Instead, several greeted him. It was awkward, but not unpleasant. His teacher, Mrs. Harper, began the day with a surprising announcement. "I spoke with the principal and Mr. Miller," she said warmly, "and we thought it would be valuable if we could all visit Ethan's farm next week as part of our community project." The room erupted with chatter, but unlike before, it was filled with genuine excitement. Even those who had mocked him most fervently raised their hands, asking questions about what they would see, what animals were there, and whether they could try helping with the chores. Ethan could hardly believe it. He answered quietly but with more confidence than before, describing the animals, the vegetable gardens, and the wide-open spaces. As he spoke, he realized the faces looking back at him were filled not with skepticism, but with curiosity. It was a strange feeling. The very things that had once made him an outsider were now the source of admiration. During recess, a few students approached him, not to tease but to ask for more details. "Do you really name all the cows?" asked one girl. "What's it like during a storm?" asked another. Ethan found himself speaking more freely than he thought possible. He described how he could sense when a storm was coming by, watching the animals' behavior, how calving season kept them up through cold nights, and how he loved watching the fields turn golden during the harvest. The students listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word. Even the teachers began to treat him differently. Mrs. Harper praised Ethan during class, not out of pity, but recognizing his deep knowledge and unique experiences. Mr. Thompson, the principal, stopped him in the hallway to personally thank him for teaching the entire school an unexpected lesson about community and hard work. For Ethan, it was a whirlwind of new emotions. The fear that had once clung to him now slowly dissolved, replaced by cautious acceptance. At lunch, the real change became undeniable. Ethan was no longer sitting alone. A small group invited him to join their table. Though hesitant at first, he accepted, quietly sitting down with his tray. The conversation, once filled with dismissive remarks, now centered around the upcoming visit to the farm. They wanted to know about everything: how to milk a cow, how tractors worked, and what it was like to care for so many animals. Ethan answered as best he could, surprised to find himself enjoying the attention, not as a spectacle, but as someone who had something valuable to share. Later that day, even students who had not spoken to him in years approached him. Some offered awkward but sincere apologies, while others simply tried to befriend him. Fascinated by the world they had previously ridiculed, Ethan did not hold grudges. He knew from watching the animals that patience often yielded better results than resistance. He simply listened, responded, and let their words wash over him without bitterness. At home, Ethan could not hide the subtle smile on his face. Mike, observant as always, noticed it instantly. "Good day?" he asked without looking up from fixing a gate hinge. Ethan, without hesitation, replied, "A really good day." Sarah, hearing this from the porch, quietly wiped away a tear of relief. The farmhouse, usually echoing with the sounds of the wind and animals, now seemed to resonate with a new kind of peace. As the days passed, the preparations for the farm visit became the talk of the school. Students were buzzing about it, and teachers coordinated with Mike and Sarah to organize the logistics. Ethan, once invisible to many of his classmates, now found himself at the center of the excitement. It felt surreal, but also comforting. Even more surprising was how some of the older students, hearing about the farm visit, showed interest. A few high schoolers who had siblings in Ethan's grade asked if they could help or visit as well. Mike, when informed, only smiled and said, "The more, the merrier." Sarah made extra plans for homemade pies and snacks, insisting that if the town was finally coming to see the farm, they would be welcomed properly. Ethan could not have imagined this change just a week ago. He no longer walked the halls with his head down. There was still hesitation, of course. He knew acceptance was not always permanent, and kindness could sometimes be fleeting. But even so, he had found something stronger than the temporary shifts of social tides. He had found pride. Pride in his family, in his work, and most importantly, in himself. One afternoon, as he sat under the old oak tree behind the barn, Ethan looked out across the fields, feeling for the first time that he did not need to hide who he was. The farm, with all its worn fences, weathered barns, and endless fields, was not just his home. It was his story. And now, it was a story others wanted to hear. The visit was only days away, and though part of him worried about how things would unfold, another part, the part nurtured by his father's quiet strength and his mother's endless love, was ready. Ready to show them all not just the farm, but the heart that kept it alive. What he did not know yet was that this visit would become much more than a simple school field trip. It would be the day his classmates would see, with their own eyes, the truth that words alone could never fully capture. And Ethan would no longer just be the farm boy. He would be the bridge between two worlds. The day of the school visit to the Miller farm arrived under a sky of perfect blue, with the sun casting warm rays over the land. The farm looked particularly vibrant that morning, as if it too sensed the significance of the day. Ethan stood near the front porch, nervously adjusting the collar of his flannel shirt, watching as yellow school buses rolled slowly down the dusty road leading to the property. The sight of them, carrying classmates who once whispered and laughed about him, made his heart race. Yet, as he glanced at Mike and Sarah, both calmly finishing the final preparations, Ethan found courage in their quiet presence. The first group of students stepped off the buses, eyes wide, taking in the sight of the sprawling fields, the old but well-maintained barns, the shimmering pond at the far end of the property, and the herds of cattle grazing peacefully. Teachers, equally taken aback, whispered among themselves, clearly impressed by the scale and beauty of the place. What they had imagined as a small, modest farm now revealed itself as a vast, intricate operation. Mike welcomed everyone with a simple but warm greeting. "We're glad to have you all here," he said. "You'll see today that a farm is more than just animals and dirt. It's life, it's work, it's community." He then motioned to Ethan, "And this young man knows more about it than most grown-ups." Ethan swallowed hard, stepping forward, as all eyes turned to him. His knees trembled slightly, but then he saw the familiar oak tree in the distance, the one where he had always found comfort. Drawing strength from that small anchor, he began leading the tour. He showed them the barns first, explaining the daily routines, feeding the animals, cleaning stalls, monitoring the health of the livestock. He spoke about the cows by name, detailing each one's temperament and habits. His classmates followed, captivated, realizing that the boy they had dismissed as strange had an astonishing knowledge and a deep love for every aspect of farm life. Sarah and Mike watched from a distance, allowing Ethan to guide the students himself. His voice, once shaky, grew steadier with each step. As the tour moved to the vegetable gardens, Ethan explained crop rotations, organic farming techniques, and how they avoided harmful chemicals. Students listened, genuinely curious, and several teachers took notes, visibly impressed with the complexity and responsibility behind Ethan's explanations. When they reached the open fields, Ethan introduced the students to the horses. One of them, a chestnut mare named Bella, gently nuzzled Ethan as he approached, earning gasps and smiles from the group. Ethan explained how animals could sense your mood and trust you when treated with kindness. The students, one by one, were invited to pet Bella, each interaction softening even the most skeptical among them. As the visit continued, the students began asking questions, not forced or obligatory, but genuine. How do you know if a cow is sick? Is it hard to get up before the sun every day? Do you ever get scared during storms? Ethan answered each question with the calm certainty that comes from lived experience. His classmates listened intently, fascinated by the world that had always seemed so distant from their own. Perhaps the most unexpected shift came from the students who had been the cruelest. One of them, standing awkwardly by the fence, finally asked, "Ethan, why didn't you tell us all this before?" Ethan shrugged. "I tried, I just didn't know how to make you see it the way I do." The honesty of his response resonated deeper than any of them expected. The group fell quiet, for a moment, realizing that maybe they had never really listened at all. As the tour concluded, the students gathered under the old oak tree where tables had been set up with homemade snacks, courtesy of Sarah. Freshly baked pies, cornbread, and pitchers of lemonade awaited them. The students eagerly dug in, laughing, and talking about the animals, the machinery, and even asking if they could come back another time. Ethan sat quietly, watching from the edge of the group as the students enjoyed themselves. Then, to his surprise, a few classmates motioned for him to join them. Tentatively, he did. Conversations flowed naturally. They asked about life on the farm, about his daily chores, about what he loved most about it. And for the first time, Ethan found himself speaking freely, without fear or hesitation. The teachers standing nearby marveled at the transformation. The same children who had dismissed Ethan days ago now surrounded him, listening, laughing, and learning. Mike, arms crossed, leaned against a fence post, exchanging a look of quiet satisfaction with Sarah. They both knew that what they were witnessing was more than just a successful school visit. It was the undoing of prejudice, the beginning of understanding. Before the buses arrived to take the students back to school, Mr. Thompson gathered everyone together and thanked the Millers. "I think we've all learned more today than any textbook could have taught us," he said sincerely. "Not just about farming, but about respect, community, and seeing people beyond first impressions." As the students climbed back onto the buses, many waved at Ethan, some shouting "thank you" or "see you soon." Ethan waved back, unable to hide the small but genuine smile on his face. He felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The laughter and judgment of the past week seemed distant now, replaced by curiosity and respect. That evening, back at home, Ethan sat with his parents by the fireplace. "They liked it," he said softly, still processing the day. Mike nodded. "Of course they did. You showed them the truth," Sarah added gently. "And you showed them you." Ethan, leaning back into his chair, let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The farm remained the same. The fields, stretched out under the setting sun, the animals settled in for the night, and the familiar sounds of crickets filled the air. But for Ethan, everything felt different. He no longer saw the farm as something to hide or defend. It was his story, his strength, and now, thanks to that one unforgettable day, it was something that others finally understood. The change was quiet, subtle, but it was real. And as Ethan drifted off to sleep that night, He did so knowing that he no longer stood alone. His classmates had seen the heart of the farm, and in doing so, they had finally seen him. The old oak tree outside swayed gently in the night breeze, as if silently nodding its approval. Ethan's world had shifted, and he was ready for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed the school visit, the shift in Ethan's world became undeniable and permanent. The once quiet and withdrawn boy who sat alone at lunch was now greeted by classmates who genuinely sought his company. Not everyone became a close friend overnight, but the fear, suspicion, and ridicule that had once followed Ethan down the hallways were gone, replaced by curiosity, respect, and most importantly, acceptance. The farm that was once a source of laughter and mockery became a symbol of pride, not only for Ethan but for the entire school. Teachers began incorporating lessons about agriculture, sustainability, and local businesses into the curriculum, using Ethan's family farm as a case study. The students had seen with their own eyes how much Ethan knew, how much he loved what he did, and how crucial farms like his were to their daily lives. Ethan often found himself being asked to explain concepts or share stories about the animals. Where he once had to hide his passion, now he was invited to share it openly. Mike and Sarah noticed the change immediately. Ethan, who used to come home exhausted from carrying the weight of humiliation, now returned each day with small stories about his classmates' questions, about how they wanted to know more about crop seasons or how to care for animals. His voice, once so hesitant when talking about school, now carried a tone of quiet excitement. He was no longer surviving each day, he was living it fully. One weekend, without any prompting, Ethan invited a few classmates over to the farm. Mike and Sarah, surprised but pleased, helped prepare for the visit. This time it was not a formal school event. It was just kids wanting to spend time on the farm, to see the animals again, and to learn more from Ethan himself. As they roamed the fields, fed the animals, and listened to Ethan's calm explanations, it became clear that these children were not just there out of curiosity. They were there because they respected him. Ethan stood beneath the old oak tree with a few classmates gathered around him, telling them about how he could predict changes in the weather by observing the cows' behavior or the way the birds flew. One of the boys, who had once led the cruel jokes, asked, "Ethan, how did you know all this stuff before we even noticed?" Ethan, without bitterness, replied, "Because I was always watching even when you thought I wasn't." The boy nodded, eyes downcast, but Ethan simply smiled and moved on to show them the vegetable gardens. No resentment, just understanding. As spring approached, the school announced its annual community fair, an event that brought together families, local businesses, and organizations from the entire region. To everyone's surprise, Mike accepted an invitation for the Miller farm to host an exhibit. On the day of the fair, the family prepared a booth that displayed fresh produce, photographs of the farm through the seasons, and even a small petting area where children could meet a few of the farm animals under Ethan's supervision. The booth became the centerpiece of the event. Parents who had heard their children's stories finally met Mike and Sarah, expressing their admiration and gratitude. Children from other schools visited, eager to see what they had only heard about. Ethan stood proudly at the center of it, all guiding people through the exhibit, answering questions with the same steady confidence he had discovered in himself weeks earlier. Mike, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watched his son with a proud but humble expression. Sarah stood beside him, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Look at him." Mike only nodded, feeling the deepest sense of fulfillment a father could ever know. He had not only defended his son, he had empowered him. Toward the end of the fair, the principal of Ethan's school took the microphone and addressed the crowd. "This year," he said, "we learned a lesson that was not written in any textbook. We learned the value of community, of respect, and of looking beyond appearances. And we have Ethan and the Miller family to thank for that." The crowd erupted in applause. Ethan, blushing but smiling, stood tall, no longer the shy boy afraid of what others might think. From that day forward, Ethan was no longer just the farm boy. He was Ethan, the one who knew the land, who cared for the animals, who showed the town what true pride looked like. Even those who had once mocked him now looked to him with admiration, often asking for his advice or inviting him into conversations they would have never considered him part of before. Life returned to its steady rhythm on the farm, but something had changed within Ethan forever. He knew the road ahead would not always be easy. Life never is. But he also knew that the strength he had found, the pride his father had shown him, and the love that had surrounded him would always be there. On quiet evenings, Ethan often sat under the oak tree, watching the sun set over the fields. He listened to the familiar sounds of the farm, the rustling of the wind, the low calls of the cattle, the soft songs of the birds, and felt at peace. The laughter of his classmates no longer haunted him. Instead, it had transformed into shared laughter, genuine and kind, echoing through the fields whenever they visited. Ethan had not just overcome a difficult moment, he had changed it. He had planted seeds not only in the soil, but in the hearts of those around him. And as the seasons passed, those seeds continued to grow just like the crops on the farm, reminding everyone that the most powerful lessons often come not from the pages of a book, but from the quiet strength of someone who refuses to give up. The farm stood as it always had, simple and strong. But now, to everyone who passed by, it was no longer just a patch of land. It was the place where a boy named Ethan taught an entire town how to see the world differently. As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, Ethan smiled, knowing that all of it, was just the beginning.